A wife took care of her paralyzed husband for 30 years. One day, she finds a photograph of him standing up taken after the accident that shatters her reality into pieces. The attic was warm and thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. Dust motes danced in the thin sunlight streaming through a small, grime-covered window. Margaret Langley adjusted the scarf around her neck, tying it tighter to shield herself from the occasional draft. She had put off this task for years, the sorting of boxes filled with remnants of their shared life. But now, with spring cleaning upon her and a rare surge of energy, she decided it was time. She pulled open an unmarked box, her hands brushing aside faded labels and old newspaper padding. Inside were keepsakes that spanned decades, birthday cards, childhood drawings from nieces and nephews, ticket stubs from long-forgotten movies and photographs. So many photographs. Each picture told a story. Vacations, family dinners, quiet afternoons in their backyard. The kind of ordinary moments that seemed inconsequential at the time but now felt monumental. Margaret smiled as she came across a photograph of their wedding day. Thomas looked so young, full of promise and joy, his dark suit contrasting sharply against her pale lace dress. She lingered on the image, her heart swelling with affection and nostalgia. But the sweetness of the moment was interrupted as she shuffled through more photos and landed on one that didn't belong. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled the picture from the stack. It was unmistakably Thomas, standing tall and smiling, his arms casually draped over the shoulders of two other men she didn't recognize. They were outdoors, perhaps at a park, with a lake shimmering in the background. Thomas looked strong, vibrant, and carefree, no wheelchair in sight. Her hands trembled as she examined the image more closely. The date written on the back in neat, faded ink sent a chill through her. The photograph was marked as taken 10 years after the accident that had left Thomas paralyzed from the waist down. She blinked, trying to make sense of it. It had to be a mistake, a mislabeled photo. Perhaps the person in the picture wasn't Thomas at all, just someone who resembled him. But the more she stared, the harder it became to deny the truth. This was her husband. The same easy smile, the same dark eyes that softened when they looked at her. The same small scar along his jawline from a childhood bicycle accident he had often recounted. Her rational mind fought back. Could the photo have been altered? She'd read about such things. Photo manipulation had become more common in recent years. Or perhaps it was a cruel prank, though she couldn't imagine who would play such a tasteless joke. And then, the most uncomfortable thought of all crept in. Had Thomas lied to her? Margaret placed the photograph down, pacing in the cramped attic space. She tried to reconstruct the timeline in her mind. The accident had been devastating. A car crash on a rainy night, leaving Thomas in the hospital for months. The doctors had been clear, his injuries were permanent. Margaret had cried alongside him, vowing to stay by his side no matter what. She became his caretaker, helping him navigate a new life confined to a wheelchair. She had sacrificed so much, her career, her freedom, her dreams, for a marriage she believed was rooted in love and loyalty. But now, doubt seeped into her memories like ink spilling across parchment. How could this photo exist? Why had she never seen it before? And most troubling of all, why hadn't Thomas mentioned it? She reached for the box again, rummaging through its contents in hopes of finding more context. But nothing else stood out. No accompanying notes, no additional photographs that hinted at the truth. Just that one impossible image. Margaret sat on an old trunk, her hands trembling as she held the photograph again. Maybe there was a logical explanation, she reasoned. Maybe the date was wrong, or the photograph wasn't as recent as it seemed. But a nagging voice in the back of her mind wouldn't let her rest. She needed answers. For the rest of the day, Margaret carried the photograph with her, glancing at it every so often as if a second look might reveal some hidden clue she had overlooked. When evening came, she prepared dinner in silence, her usual chatter with Thomas replaced by a heavy, unspoken tension. Thomas, ever perceptive, noticed. "You're awfully quiet today," he said as they ate. His voice was warm, familiar, comforting. It was the same voice that had reassured her on so many sleepless nights, the voice that had soothed her fears and anchored her through years of challenges. Margaret forced a smile. "Just tired," she replied, though her heart raced as she spoke. She studied his face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that he might know what she had found. But he seemed as calm and composed as ever. After dinner, while Thomas watched television in the living room, Margaret retreated to their bedroom, clutching the photograph like a secret she wasn't ready to share. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it under the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Questions swirled in her mind, each more unsettling than the last. What if he had been able to walk all this time? What if he had chosen not to tell her? She shook her head, dismissing the thought as absurd. Thomas loved her. She was certain of that. He wouldn't deceive her, not about something so monumental. Would he? Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams filled with fragmented images of Thomas walking, running, laughing, all the things she hadn't seen him do in decades. She woke before dawn, the photograph still clutched in her hand. As the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't let this gnaw at her indefinitely. She needed to know the truth, even if it meant uncovering something she wasn't prepared to face. With a deep breath, she resolved to confront Thomas, not with accusations, but with the photograph itself. She would ask him about it, listen to his explanation, and finally lay her doubts to rest. But as she glanced at the photograph one last time, a thought struck her that made her stomach twist in knots. What if the truth wasn't something she wanted to hear? What if the life she thought she knew was built on a lie? Margaret shook the thought away, steeling herself for the conversation to come. Whatever the answer, she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. The photograph sat on Margaret's nightstand like an unspoken accusation. Every time her gaze wandered in its direction, a pang of unease followed. She hadn't yet confronted Thomas. The time never seemed right, and the words to explain her discovery eluded her. Instead, she turned inward, sifting through decades of memories to make sense of the image. What she found were cracks in the foundation of a life she'd thought unshakable. Margaret's earliest recollections of the accident came to her with startling clarity. The night of the crash was seared into her mind, as vivid now as it had been all those years ago. It had been raining, a torrential downpour that turned the roads slick and treacherous. Thomas had been late coming home, his usual punctuality thrown off by an unexpected business meeting. When the call came, the voice on the other end was rushed and unfamiliar. "Your husband's been in an accident," it had said. "You need to come to the hospital." She remembered the sterile smell of antiseptic in the emergency room, the soft hum of machines keeping Thomas stable, the doctor's grave expression as he explained the extent of the injuries, the damage to his spine that would render him unable to walk. But now, with the photograph in hand, she began to question the narrative she had so readily accepted. Had she ever seen the X-rays, the medical records, or had she simply trusted what she was told? Overwhelmed by grief and too focused on caring for her husband to probe further, Margaret replayed their conversations from those early days, searching for inconsistencies. Thomas had spoken little of the accident itself, claiming his memory of the event was hazy. At the time, she had attributed it to trauma, a natural response to such a devastating ordeal. But now, that vagueness felt suspicious, like a carefully curated vagueness designed to avoid scrutiny. As the days passed, Margaret found herself revisiting other moments that had once seemed inconsequential but now carried a strange weight. She recalled a time, years after the accident, when they'd attended a family reunion. One of Thomas's cousins had asked, in a joking tone, "Are you sure you're not just faking it to get out of yard work?" Thomas had laughed, a little too loudly, brushing off the comment with a quick change of subject. At the time, it had seemed harmless, but now Margaret wondered if there had been a flicker of discomfort in his reaction. Then there was the matter of his wheelchair. It was state-of-the-art, customized to fit his needs. But on more than one occasion, Margaret had found it slightly adjusted, handles raised, the seat shifted forward. She'd assumed it was the work of a caretaker or perhaps the result of a service checkup. Now she wasn't so sure. The most troubling memory came from a summer evening 5 years after the accident. Thomas had insisted she take a weekend away with her friends, something he rarely encouraged. When she returned, the house had a strange energy about it, as though it had been lived in differently. There was a scuff mark on the kitchen floor that hadn't been there before, one that looked suspiciously like the kind a shoe might make. She'd asked Thomas about it, and he'd shrugged, saying it must have been the cleaning lady. Margaret had let it go, unwilling to dwell on what seemed like an unimportant detail. Now, with the photograph in her possession, all those moments felt like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. Margaret began to investigate discreetly, wary of alerting Thomas to her growing suspicions. She started with their photo albums, combing through years of snapshots and family portraits. Nothing seemed amiss. Every image of Thomas after the accident showed him in his wheelchair. But the photograph in the attic suggested another life, one that had somehow been carefully erased. One afternoon, while Thomas was napping, Margaret slipped into his office. She hadn't been in there for years, respecting his need for privacy. The room was meticulously organized, with bookshelves lining the walls and a polished mahogany desk at its center. She opened the drawers cautiously, her hands trembling. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of neatly filed papers, she found a box labeled "Personal." Inside were mementos from Thomas's younger years, old driver's licenses, a pocket watch, and a few letters from college friends. But there was something else, a set of keys she didn't recognize. They were attached to a worn leather keychain with the name Tucker's Garage embossed in gold. Margaret frowned, trying to recall the name. It wasn't the dealership where they'd bought their car, and she couldn't remember Thomas ever mentioning it. She tucked the keys into her pocket, intending to investigate later. As she closed the drawer, her eyes fell on a framed photograph on the desk. It was a picture of the two of them, taken shortly after the accident. Margaret was smiling, her arm draped protectively over Thomas's shoulder. But for the first time, she noticed the way his hands were positioned. One rested on the armrest of his wheelchair, but the other gripped the edge of the cushion as though bearing weight. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but now it felt like another clue in a growing collection of inconsistencies. That evening, as they sat together watching television, Margaret's mind raced with questions she didn't dare ask. Thomas seemed his usual self, calm, attentive, loving. But every time he shifted in his chair, she found herself watching him closely, searching for signs that he might not be as incapacitated as he claimed. The photograph became an obsession. Margaret took it to a local photography studio, hoping the technician might confirm its authenticity. The man studied it under a magnifying glass, nodding thoughtfully. "It's genuine," he said. "The paper, the ink, everything matches the era. Whoever took this photo knew what they were doing." His words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. If the photograph was real, then her husband had been standing, walking, living a life she knew nothing about. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, filling her with a strange mix of anger and hope. She decided to visit Tucker's Garage, using the keys as her guide. It was a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that had likely been passed down through generations. The owner, a grizzled man in his 60s, greeted her with a wary smile. When she showed him the keys, his expression shifted to one of recognition. "These belong to Thomas, didn't they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The man hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I haven't seen him in years. He used to come by a lot, though. Good man. Always brought his truck in for tune-ups." Margaret's heart pounded. His truck? After the accident. The man frowned. "Accident? No, ma'am. Thomas was always on his feet when he came here, strong as an ox." The room seemed to tilt around her, the ground shifting beneath her feet. Margaret thanked the man and left quickly, her mind spinning with possibilities. As she drove home, one thought consumed her. If Thomas had been lying about the accident, what else had he kept from her? The unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back. The photograph burned a hole in Margaret's thoughts, a relentless reminder that her reality was crumbling. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed answers, even if they shattered everything she'd built with Thomas. That evening, she waited for the right moment. The house was quiet, the distant hum of the dishwasher filling the space between them as they sat in the living room. Thomas flipped through a magazine, seemingly at ease. But Margaret's heart raced. She cleared her throat, her voice soft but firm. "Thomas, can we talk?" He glanced up, his brow furrowing slightly. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Margaret reached for the photograph she'd tucked into her cardigan pocket. Her fingers trembled as she placed it on the coffee table between them. "I found this while going through some old boxes in the attic." Thomas's expression froze, his eyes locking onto the image. For a moment, he didn't speak, and the silence stretched like a taut wire between them. "What is this, Margaret?" His voice was low, laced with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or anger. "That's what I'd like to know," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "It's dated 10 years after your accident, Thomas. You're standing in this picture, smiling, walking." He pushed the magazine aside, leaning forward as his gaze darkened. "It's obviously a mistake," he said curtly. "Someone mislabeled it. Or maybe it's an old photo you're remembering wrong." Margaret shook her head. "The man at the photo studio confirmed it. The date matches the paper and ink. This isn't an old photo mislabeled. It's real." Thomas's jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment, his usual calm demeanor slipped. "So what are you accusing me of?" he snapped. "Faking my injury? Lying to you for decades? Is that what you think of me?" "I don't know what to think, Thomas." Margaret's voice cracked, her frustration boiling over. "But this doesn't make sense. I've spent years caring for you, building a life around the accident, around your needs. And now this? How do you expect me to ignore it?" Thomas's face reddened as he slammed a hand on the armrest of his wheelchair. "I don't owe you an explanation for every little inconsistency in the past. Maybe you're imagining things. Maybe you want to find something wrong where there isn't." His words stung, and tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "Imagining things? You're the one with secrets, Thomas. This photo, this life I never knew about, it's tearing me apart." Thomas wheeled himself back abruptly, his expression cold. "Drop it, Margaret. If you love me, you'll let this go." She stared at him, stunned by his sudden harshness. This wasn't the man she thought she knew. Or maybe, she realized, she'd only seen what he wanted her to see. His reaction only solidified her resolve. If he wouldn't give her answers, she'd find them herself. The following day, Margaret began her search in earnest. She started with Thomas's belongings, sifting through drawers and closets for anything that might shed light on the photograph. Most of what she found seemed innocuous old receipts, letters from friends, trinkets from their travels. But in a small box tucked behind a stack of books in his office, she uncovered something unexpected. A collection of photographs, all taken long after the accident. In these images, Thomas was vibrant, active, standing tall and confident. He appeared to be living a parallel life, one she'd never known. There were photos of him hiking in the woods, laughing with people she didn't recognize, even standing outside a building with a sign in a foreign language. Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through them, each one a dagger to her sense of reality. One photograph caught her attention, a group shot in which Thomas stood next to a woman with auburn hair, her arm casually draped around his shoulders. The two of them seemed close, their smiles intimate. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Reunion 1995. Margaret's heart sank. She didn't know who this woman was, but the familiarity in her pose suggested a relationship that went beyond mere acquaintance. Who was this person, and why had Thomas kept these photos hidden? She decided to broaden her search, looking for connections beyond their home. Remembering the keys she'd found at Tucker's garage, Margaret made a call to the local library, asking if they had old newspaper archives. When the librarian confirmed they did, she headed there immediately, driven by a need for answers. At the library, Margaret combed through articles from the years following Thomas's accident. It was painstaking work, scrolling through microfilm reels and scanning headlines for anything relevant. Her perseverance paid off when she stumbled upon a small article in the local paper, dated 2 years after the accident. The article described a charity event at a nearby country club, hosted by none other than Thomas. The accompanying photo showed him standing next to a row of donors, a golf club in hand. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The event had taken place during a time when she'd been working long hours at the hospital, taking extra shifts to make ends meet. She'd had no idea he'd been involved in anything like this. Why had he lied? And why had he chosen to involve himself in public events where he could easily be recognized? The questions piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. Margaret's next stop was the address she'd found scribbled on the back of one of the photographs. It led her to a small cafe on the outskirts of town, one she'd never visited before. She approached the barista, showing him the photograph of Thomas and the auburn-haired woman. "Do you recognize either of these people?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. The barista squinted at the photo, then nodded. "Yeah, they used to come here all the time. Real nice folks. Haven't seen them in years, though. Are you family?" Margaret's stomach churned. "Something like that. Do you remember when they stopped coming?" The barista shrugged. "Must have been at least 15 years ago. They were regulars for a while, though." 15 years ago. The timeline overlapped with a period when Thomas had been especially withdrawn, claiming his health was worsening. Margaret had attributed it to his condition, never suspecting there might be another reason. Her investigation left her more confused than ever. The picture of Thomas's life she'd pieced together was fragmented and contradictory, filled with secrets she couldn't yet fully grasp. But one thing was clear: the man she'd devoted her life to had been living a lie. Margaret returned home that evening, the weight of her discoveries pressing heavily on her. Thomas greeted her from his wheelchair, his demeanor warm and familiar, as though nothing had changed. But Margaret saw him differently now. The man before her was a stranger cloaked in familiarity, his true self hidden behind years of deceit. As she prepared dinner, her mind raced with questions. How much of their life together had been real? How far did the lies go? And most importantly, why had he felt the need to deceive her? Margaret resolved to keep digging, determined to uncover the truth no matter how painful it might be. For better or worse, the undoing of time had begun, and there was no turning back. Margaret's determination to unravel the mystery drove her deeper into Thomas's past. The revelations she'd uncovered so far, the photograph, the hidden life, and the suspicious charity event, weren't enough. She needed clarity. Her first step was reaching out to old acquaintances and family friends who had known Thomas before his accident. Surely someone would have noticed something strange back then. She started with Evelyn, an old neighbor who had lived next door to them when they were newlyweds. Evelyn was sharp for her age, her memory vivid despite the years. Over tea at her cozy cottage, Margaret broached the subject carefully. "Do you remember much about Thomas after the accident?" Margaret asked, cradling her cup in her hands. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "Oh yes, it was such a tragic time for you both. But, come to think of it, there were a few odd things. I remember he didn't seem as helpless as I expected. I always chalked it up to pride, wanting to appear strong despite his condition." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Did anything else strike you as unusual?" Evelyn hesitated. "Well, there was a period when he disappeared for months. You said he was at a rehabilitation center, but no one could visit him. It was strange, really. Most facilities don't have those kinds of restrictions." Margaret's stomach churned. She vaguely remembered that time, but her younger self had been too overwhelmed with work and caring for their home to question it. Evelyn's observation added another layer to the enigma. Her next stop was Harold, a retired colleague of Thomas's who had worked with him at the insurance firm before his accident. Harold's memory wasn't as sharp as Evelyn's, but over lunch at a local diner, Margaret probed gently. "Thomas always spoke fondly of his time at the firm," she began. "Do you recall much about him before the accident?" Harold chuckled. "Oh, he was a character, all right. Ambitious, charming. But after the accident, he was a ghost. Quit without much notice. We all thought he'd been too humiliated by his condition to return." Margaret frowned. Did you ever visit him after the accident? Harold shook his head. No, he kept everyone at arm's length. We figured he didn't want us to see him like that. Margaret nodded, filing the information away. It matched Evelyn's account of Thomas's isolation, but it still didn't explain the photograph or the life he'd hidden. Determined to dig deeper, Margaret visited the hospital where Thomas had been treated after the accident. She made an appointment with the records department, armed with the details of his admission and stay. The clerk, a polite young man, pulled up the files on a computer and handed her a printout. As Margaret scanned the documents, her heart sank. The records were incomplete. There was an admission date, notes about his initial injuries, and a discharge summary months later, but no detailed treatment records. It was as if large portions of his hospital stay had been wiped clean. "This can't be everything," Margaret said, her voice tight with frustration. The clerk frowned. "That's all we have in the system. Sometimes older records get lost when we transition to new databases." Margaret wasn't convinced. Something felt off. She asked if she could speak to anyone who might have worked at the hospital during that time. The clerk hesitated but eventually pointed her toward an older nurse who was on the brink of retirement. The nurse, a no-nonsense woman named Susan, agreed to meet Margaret in the cafeteria. Margaret laid out her concerns, carefully framing her questions to avoid suspicion. "I just want to understand what happened during my husband's treatment," Margaret said. "The records are incomplete, and I thought maybe someone who was here then might remember." Susan leaned back, her sharp eyes studying Margaret. "I do remember your husband, Thomas, right? The accident made a big impression on all of us. But there was something unusual about his case." Margaret leaned forward, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "He was moved to a private wing a few weeks into his stay," Susan said. "That wing was reserved for special cases, high-profile patients, people with money to burn. He wasn't a typical patient after that. I barely saw him, and neither did most of the staff." "Do you know why he was moved?" Susan shook her head. "No idea, but I remember thinking it was strange. His injuries weren't that severe, at least not at first. Then suddenly, he was completely off-limits." Margaret thanked her, her mind spinning with questions. If Thomas had been moved to a private wing, who had arranged it? And why? Her investigation led her next to the rehabilitation center where Thomas had supposedly spent months recovering. She found the facility, an older building on the outskirts of town, but when she inquired about records, the administrator informed her that they had no record of Thomas being treated there. "That's impossible," Margaret said, her frustration mounting. "He was here for months. I visited him a few times myself." The administrator shrugged apologetically. "We've searched our archives thoroughly. There's no file on a Thomas Caldwell." Margaret left the center feeling like she was falling into an abyss. If Thomas hadn't been treated there, where had he been during those months? And what had he been doing? She returned home that evening, exhausted but resolute. The gaps in Thomas's story were widening, and the more she learned, the more she realized she'd barely scratched the surface. Her marriage, her life, the very foundation of her identity, all of it felt like a fragile construct built on lies. Thomas noticed her weariness as she walked through the door. "Long day?" he asked, his voice as casual as ever. Margaret forced a smile. "Yes, just errands and some catching up with old friends." He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and returned to his book. Margaret watched him from the doorway, studying his face, his posture, the way he carried himself. For decades, she had seen him as a man bound by physical limitations, a victim of circumstance. Now, she saw a man who was hiding something monumental, something that could shatter the life they'd built together. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret pulled out the photograph once more, holding it under the soft glow of her bedside lamp. She traced Thomas's face with her finger, his confident smile a stark contrast to the man she'd grown accustomed to. She whispered to herself, "Who are you, Thomas? And what else are you hiding?" The pieces of the puzzle were still scattered, but Margaret knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. Margaret's mind was a whirlwind of questions and suspicions. The photograph she had found was like a tiny, jagged piece of a puzzle she didn't know existed. Yet no matter how she turned it, it wouldn't fit into the narrative of her life. Determined to push forward, she decided to search again through the same boxes in the attic, hoping they might yield more clues. The attic was still as dusty and chaotic as when she'd first unearthed the troubling photo. Margaret methodically sifted through papers, memorabilia, and forgotten keepsakes. The hours stretched as she flipped through faded journals, old receipts, and holiday cards until something unexpected surfaced. A second photograph, buried beneath a stack of yellowed letters. Her breath caught as she examined it. This one was even more unsettling than the first. In the image, Thomas stood in a sharply tailored suit, surrounded by a small group of well-dressed people at what appeared to be a formal event. The backdrop was ornate, with chandeliers and gilded decor suggesting a high-profile venue. Her eyes darted to the date scrawled in pen on the back. It was years after the first photo and still long after his supposed accident. The implications were undeniable. Thomas had been walking again. Yet here he was, in her present-day reality, confined to his wheelchair and insisting he'd never recovered. The disbelief curdling in her stomach was joined by anger. How many lies had she been living? She studied the faces in the photograph more closely. Among the group, none were familiar to her, not family or friends. Yet their postures and expressions radiated a camaraderie that suggested they knew Thomas well. Who were they? Why had Thomas never mentioned this event or these people? Margaret's focus locked on one man in particular. He was standing closest to Thomas, his hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He seemed middle-aged, with a kind but guarded expression. The faint hint of recognition tickled at the edges of Margaret's mind, but she couldn't place him. Desperate for answers, she flipped the photograph over again, scanning for any additional details. The back was frustratingly blank, save for the date. Her curiosity burned hotter now. There was something about that man, a sense that he held a key to unraveling the truth. But how would she find him? Margaret recalled the charity gala mentioned in the first photograph. If Thomas had been connected to an organization or event, perhaps it could lead her closer to this mystery man. She turned to her computer and began scouring online archives, local news articles, and social media posts tied to similar galas from that time. Hours passed with little to show for her efforts. Just as she was about to give up for the night, a grainy digital archive of a local newspaper caught her eye. The headline was mundane. Community leaders gather to support Arts Foundation. Beneath it was a small photograph of a group of attendees, and there he was, the same man from the second photo, standing in the background, his face partially obscured but unmistakable. The article identified him as Edwin Harper, a prominent local philanthropist. Margaret's heart raced as she scribbled down his name and contact details gleaned from a quick online search. If Edwin Harper had been close to Thomas during that time, he might hold the answers she sought. The next day, Margaret called the number she had found. Her voice was steady but firm as she explained her reason for reaching out, framing her inquiry as a simple search for context about her husband's past. To her relief, the man agreed to meet her at a nearby cafe, though his tone carried a hint of hesitation. When Margaret arrived, Edwin Harper was already seated, his hands folded neatly on the table. He greeted her with a polite smile, but his eyes held a wariness that Margaret recognized immediately. He was guarding something. "Thank you for meeting with me," Margaret said, sliding the photograph across the table. "I found this recently. It's my husband, Thomas. You're in the picture, too." Edwin picked up the photograph, his expression flickering with recognition. "I remember this," he said quietly, though he avoided meeting her eyes. "Then you can understand why I'm here," Margaret pressed. "Thomas told me he was paralyzed decades ago, and yet, here he is, standing and walking. I need to know the truth." Edwin hesitated, his fingers curling tightly around the edges of the photograph. "Margaret, I don't think it's my place to explain." "Please," Margaret pleaded. "You were there. Whatever you know, it's more than I do. I deserve answers." Edwin sighed deeply, setting the photograph back on the table. All I can tell you is that Thomas was indeed walking again for a time after his accident. The circumstances, they were complicated. He didn't want anyone to know. Margaret leaned forward, her frustration boiling over. Complicated how? Why would he hide something like this? Why lie to me? To everyone? I can't answer that, Edwin said, his tone apologetic but firm. Thomas was a private man even back then. Whatever he told you or didn't tell you was his choice. Margaret's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. She wanted to shake the truth out of this man, to demand he fill in the blanks that had consumed her life. But she could see he wouldn't budge. Can you at least tell me what this event was? She asked, gesturing to the photograph. Why were you there with him? Edwin glanced at the image again before nodding reluctantly. It was a fundraiser for a medical research initiative. Thomas was heavily involved, but that's all I'm willing to say. Margaret's pulse quickened. A medical research initiative? What kind of connection could Thomas have had to something like that? Was it tied to his accident, his recovery, or something else entirely? Edwin pushed the photograph back toward her. I'm sorry, Margaret. That's all I can give you. She left the cafe with more questions than answers, her mind racing with possibilities. Edwin's cryptic responses had only deepened the mystery. Thomas had been walking again, that much was clear. But why had he hidden it? And what did his involvement in a medical research initiative have to do with it? As she walked home, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Her marriage, her life, it was unraveling faster than she could piece it together. But one thing was certain. She couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, waiting for her to uncover it, no matter how deeply buried it might be. Margaret stood in the doorway of their living room, the photographs clenched tightly in her hand. Thomas was in his usual spot by the window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, she hesitated. The man she'd cared for, loved, and built her life around sat before her. But now he felt like a stranger. The web of questions and contradictions she'd uncovered had left her reeling, and she could no longer contain them. Thomas? She began, her voice trembling but determined. We need to talk. He turned his wheelchair slightly, his face calm but wary. What is it, Margaret? She crossed the room and placed the photographs on the small table between them. These, she said, her voice sharpening. I found these, and I spoke to Edwin Harper. He told me enough to know there's more you've been hiding. You need to tell me the truth. Thomas's gaze dropped to the photographs. His expression hardened, but there was no surprise in his eyes, only a weary resignation. He remained silent, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his wheelchair. Don't just sit there, Thomas, Margaret pressed, her voice rising. For decades, I've been by your side. I've sacrificed everything, my career, my freedom, my dreams, to care for you. And now I find out that you could walk, that you did walk years after the accident. Do you understand what this does to me? What it means for everything we've built? Thomas's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his voice low and strained. I don't owe you an explanation. Margaret took a step closer, anger surging through her. You don't owe me an explanation? I gave up my entire life for you, Thomas. You owe me the truth. I've earned that much. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, Thomas sighed, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been placed on them. Fine, he said quietly. You want the truth? Here it is. He met her eyes, and Margaret was struck by the mixture of guilt and defiance in his gaze. I did walk again, he began. For a time, at least. After the accident, I was approached by a doctor leading an experimental treatment program. It was cutting-edge, risky, and completely under the radar. But I was desperate. The idea of spending my life in this chair. He trailed off, glancing at the wheelchair as if it were a prison. I agreed to the treatments, and they worked. Slowly, I regained movement, strength, the ability to stand and even walk short distances. Margaret stared at him, her heart pounding. If the treatments worked, then why? Why did you go back to pretending you couldn't walk? Why keep this from me? From everyone. Thomas looked down, his voice thick with emotion. Because walking again came with a price. It wasn't just about the physical recovery. There were expectations from the medical community, from the program's backers, and even from myself. They wanted me to be a success story, a living testament to their work. I became a symbol, not a person. It was overwhelming. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair, as though grounding himself. And then there was you. Margaret's breath caught. Me? Yes, he said, looking up at her. I didn't know if you loved me or if you pitied me. After the accident, you stepped in without hesitation, taking care of me in ways I never asked for but desperately needed. I told myself it was love, but I couldn't shake the doubt. If I started walking again, would that change the way you felt? Would you resent me for all the years you'd spent taking care of a man who didn't need it anymore? Or worse, would you leave? Margaret was stunned. You think I stayed with you out of pity? I didn't know. Thomas shouted, his voice breaking. I didn't want to find out. I couldn't face the possibility that everything we had was built on something hollow. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. So you lied. You let me believe you were paralyzed. Let me sacrifice everything for you, because you were too afraid to face the truth? Do you have any idea what that's done to me? Thomas's face crumpled, and he looked away. I know what I've done, and every day I hated myself for it. But the longer I stayed in the lie, the harder it became to tell you the truth. So I stopped trying. Margaret's hands shook as she paced the room, the weight of his words crashing down on her. Do you even understand what you've taken from me? The choices you stole because you couldn't be honest? The years I'll never get back. I do, Thomas said softly. And if I could go back, I'd do it differently. But I can't. All I can do is tell you the truth now and hope that you'll understand. Margaret stopped pacing and stared at him, her anger fading into a deep, aching sadness. I don't know if I can understand, Thomas. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. He nodded, tears glistening in his own eyes. I don't expect you to. I just needed you to know. The room fell silent again, the air heavy with unspoken words. Margaret felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, leaving her unsteady and uncertain. The man she had loved and cared for all these years had betrayed her trust in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Yet even now, as the truth lay bare between them, she couldn't decide whether to walk away or try to rebuild. Where do we go from here? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked up at her, his face etched with regret. That's up to you, Margaret. Whatever you decide, I'll understand. Margaret didn't respond. She turned and walked toward the window, staring out at the quiet street below. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the neighborhood. In that moment, she realized the decision she faced wasn't just about her marriage. It was about her own future, about reclaiming the life she'd given up and deciding who she wanted to be in the aftermath of betrayal. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Margaret made a silent vow to herself. Whatever happened next, she would find her own truth. The days after Thomas's confession passed in a blur for Margaret. She moved through the house like a ghost, performing the familiar routines of caregiving but with an unbearable weight pressing down on her. Every glance at him, every quiet moment shared over meals, felt tainted by the knowledge of his deception. The husband she thought she knew, the life they had built together, now seemed like an elaborate mirage. At night, Margaret lay awake in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The silence felt suffocating. Anger surged within her, sharp and hot, as she thought about the decades she had poured into caring for him. It wasn't just the physical toll of lifting, feeding, and assisting him. It was the emotional weight of being his rock, his partner in what she thought was mutual hardship. And now all of it felt like a cruel joke. The morning after the confession, Thomas tried to break the silence. Margaret, he began as she brought his breakfast tray to the table. I know there's nothing I can say to undo what I've done, But I need you to know that I didn't make this choice lightly. Margaret set the tray down with a little more force than necessary, the clatter of the utensils cutting through the room. Didn't make it lightly? She repeated, her voice trembling with controlled fury. Thomas, you stole decades from me. Decades. Do you even understand what that means? He nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. I do, and I hate myself for it. Do you? Margaret snapped, folding her arms. Because it seems like you made peace with your decision years ago while I lived under the illusion that we were in this together. You let me believe I was sacrificing out of love, out of necessity, while you sat there with your secrets and your lies. Thomas looked up at her, his face etched with guilt. I was afraid, Margaret, afraid of losing you, afraid that if you knew I could walk, you'd leave me. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. So instead, you trapped me in a life I didn't choose. You didn't give me the chance to decide for myself. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Margaret couldn't stand to be near him any longer. She grabbed her coat and left the house, needing air, space, and time to think. She wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood, memories of their life together flashing in her mind. She thought of the early years, when Thomas's paralysis had bonded them in a shared sense of struggle and resilience. She thought of the nights she'd stayed up late, massaging his legs to ease phantom pains he had claimed to feel. And she thought of the moments when she'd glimpsed something in his eyes, something she now recognized as guilt. By the time she returned home, the sun was setting. Thomas was in the living room, staring at the television, though it was clear he wasn't watching it. He turned toward her as she entered, his expression hopeful yet wary. Margaret, he said softly, I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but please let's talk. I don't want this to destroy us. She hesitated, then sat down across from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Talk, she said, but don't expect me to forgive you. Thomas took a deep breath. I know I've wronged you. I know I've robbed you of choices you should have had. But I need you to understand. My love for you was real. It still is. Every decision I made, no matter how misguided, was because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. Margaret shook her head. Love doesn't excuse what you did. Love doesn't justify decades of lies. You didn't just lie about your ability to walk, you lied about who you were. You made me question my own life, my own choices, and I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. Thomas didn't argue. He simply nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The days that followed were tense. Margaret avoided Thomas as much as possible, throwing herself into tasks around the house. She cleaned, reorganized, and even ventured into their neglected garden, finding solace in the physical act of pulling weeds and planting seeds. But no matter how busy she kept herself, the questions lingered. Had she wasted her life? Had her love for Thomas been real, or had it been shaped by a sense of duty and pity, as he'd feared? And now that she knew the truth, what did she owe him, if anything? One afternoon, while sorting through old letters and documents, Margaret came across a card Thomas had written her early in their marriage. The words were simple but heartfelt. You are my strength, my reason for believing in tomorrow. I don't deserve you, but I'll spend my life trying to. Tears welled in her eyes as she read the card. The man who had written those words was the same man who had lied to her, but he was also the man she had loved deeply for so many years. Could she reconcile the two? That evening, Margaret sat down with Thomas again. He looked up at her, surprise flickering across his face. I don't know what the future holds for us, she began, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. But I need time to figure out who I am outside of this role I've been living, and time to decide if I can forgive you. Thomas nodded, his expression a mix of relief and sorrow. Take all the time you need, he said quietly. I'll be here waiting. For the first time in days, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. She would no longer let her life be defined by someone else's choices. Whether she stayed or left, she would rebuild herself on her own terms. As she climbed into bed that night, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace. The truth had shattered the life she thought she knew, but it had also set her free. Now she had the chance to start again. And for the first time in years, she felt ready to take it. The morning Margaret left, the house was quiet, save for the soft creak of her suitcase wheels against the hardwood floor. Thomas sat in his chair by the window, watching her move methodically, every step resolute. She had told him the night before that she needed space, that she couldn't stay under the same roof while untangling the threads of her emotions. "I'll call when I'm ready to talk," she had said, her voice steady but her eyes rimmed red. "Don't try to reach out before then." Thomas had nodded, unable to muster more than a quiet, "I understand." He hated himself for what he had done, hated the way his decisions had brought them to this moment. Yet, he also understood that Margaret's departure was necessary, for both of them. Margaret drove without a set destination, letting the open road guide her. She had booked a small cabin at a lakeside retreat several hours away, but the journey itself felt like the first step toward reclaiming her life. As the miles stretched behind her, she allowed herself to reflect. The woman she was now, worn, weary, yet still resolute, was a far cry from the young bride who had vowed to stand by Thomas in sickness and in health. Somewhere along the way, she had lost parts of herself, subsumed by the roles of caregiver, partner, and protector. The cabin was modest but cozy, nestled among towering pines and overlooking a serene lake. Margaret unpacked her belongings, savoring the quiet solitude. For the first time in years, she wasn't tethered to someone else's needs. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Her days at the cabin began to take on a rhythm. Mornings were spent walking along the lakeshore, the crisp air filling her lungs and clearing her mind. Afternoons were for journaling, a practice she had abandoned years ago. With every word she wrote, she unearthed pieces of herself, dreams she had set aside, frustrations she had buried, and a quiet longing for independence she hadn't realized existed. In the evenings, she allowed herself moments of stillness, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was during one of these sunsets, with her journal resting on her lap, that Margaret began to see a glimmer of clarity. She loved Thomas, of that she was certain, but love alone couldn't erase the years of deception or the erosion of trust. If they were to have any chance of moving forward, they would need to rebuild from the ground up. Back at home, Thomas was facing his own reckoning. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt oppressive. Without Margaret's steady presence, he was forced to confront the void left behind. He began revisiting the moments that had led to his decision to hide the truth, the fear, the guilt, and the selfishness that had driven him. But it wasn't enough to simply feel remorse. Thomas knew he needed to act. He started by reaching out to the experimental treatment program that had helped him regain mobility all those years ago. It was a difficult conversation, but one he needed to have. He asked for access to his old medical records, hoping to piece together a timeline he could share with Margaret. Transparency was a small step, but it was one he was determined to take. He also began physical therapy again, not because he intended to impress Margaret, but because he wanted to prove to himself that he could be better. For too long, he had leaned on the comfort of her care, letting it absolve him of responsibility for his own life. That had to change. Weeks passed, and Margaret found herself slowly reawakening to the world around her. She enrolled in an art class at the retreat center, rediscovering her love for painting. With each stroke of the brush, she felt a sense of agency she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just Thomas's wife or caregiver. She was Margaret, a woman with her own passions, her own story. One evening, as she sat on the porch of her cabin, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Thomas, but he had honored her request for space. The text was simple. "I'm taking steps to be the man you deserve, in every sense of the word. Thank you for showing me what strength truly looks like." Margaret stared at the screen for a long time, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions. She wasn't ready to return, but the message gave her a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, despite everything, there was a path forward. When the time finally came to leave the retreat, Margaret felt a sense of calm she hadn't anticipated. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she was stronger than when she had arrived. She was no longer defined by her role in Thomas's life. She had reclaimed her own identity. The drive home was filled with a quiet determination. Margaret wasn't returning to resume the life they had lived before. She was returning to confront the future on her terms, whatever that might look like. Thomas was waiting on the porch when she pulled into the driveway. He stood, leaning on a cane, but the sight of him standing at all was enough to make her pause. He had changed in her absence, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself, with a quiet humility she hadn't seen before. Margaret stepped out of the car, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Thomas spoke, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I've been working on myself," he said. "Not for you but for me. But I hope it's enough to show you that I'm ready to rebuild, if you'll let me." Margaret nodded, her own voice trembling. "I don't know what our future looks like, Thomas, but I'm willing to find out." They walked into the house together, their steps tentative but united. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges they couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in years, their path felt honest. It was a new beginning, not bound by the past but shaped by the strength they had both found in its unraveling. Margaret and Thomas's journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about confronting the fractures in their relationship and finding a path forward. Margaret's courage to rediscover herself and demand honesty led to a transformation for both of them. And while their love bore the weight of deception, it also revealed resilience. This story reminds us that even in the face of betrayal, healing and redemption are possible when we are willing to confront the truth and make changes. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in Margaret's shoes? And if you enjoy thought-provoking stories like this, make sure to subscribe for more narratives that explore love, resilience, and the human spirit. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.